House Republicans are imploding and openly revolting. Today, the conference traveling to West Virginia for their annual policy retreat. But fewer than 100 members are even attending the event. That's less than half of the conference. One lawmaker telling Axios, quote, "I'd rather sit down with Hannibal Lecter and eat my own liver." And now the GOP majority is shrinking even more. Colorado Republican Ken Buck is announcing that he's leaving Congress in just a matter of days, torching his party on the way out.
What has frustrated you so much about this era of politics and particularly Congress? What's made it so difficult?
You really need me to say that. You need me to explain what's so difficult about this place. This place just keeps going downhill, and I don't need to spend my time here. A lot of this is personal. That's the problem. Instead of having decorum, instead of operating in a professional manner, this place has just evolved into this bickering and nonsense.
Another congressman, Chip Roy, also slamming his own party for failing to act on the border.
In 2018, we had the House, we had the Senate, we had the White House, and we had a bigger majority than we have today. And we utterly failed to secure the border. Totally dropped the ball.
Joining me now is Jonathan Capehart, the host of MSNBC's The Sunday Show with Jonathan Capehart and The Saturday Show with Jonathan Capehart, I might add, and the Washington Post associate editor, and Katty Kay, BBC News U.S. special correspondent. My thanks to both of you for joining me. Jonathan, I'd love to start with you. How much of the GOP's paralysis, in your opinion, comes from Trump's just total domination of the party now, or from a lack of spine? I feel like we see these things like Ken Buck saying what he's saying now, Jonathan, and yet it seems to be too little too late because he's saying it on the way out.
He's saying it on the way out, but that's not because he wasn't trying to get stuff done. I think it's both. I think it is a lack of spine on the part of Speaker Johnson and his leadership team, but it also speaks to Donald Trump's influence, not just over Speaker Johnson, who he talks to on a regular basis, but also on the part of the Senate. The Senate was putting together probably the most conservative immigration bill in decades, negotiated by one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Oklahoma Senator James Lankford. And Donald Trump picks up the phone or goes out on his social media platform and says, don't do it. Don't vote for the bill. And the senators don't. It doesn't even get out of the Senate to go to the House, where Speaker Johnson was already saying he was going to kill it. And so this just speaks to Donald Trump's complete takeover of the Republican Party in the House, in the Senate, the Republican National Committee, and some could argue the Supreme Court, but maybe I shouldn't go that far.
Katty Kay, could these members that are not going to the retreat we just talked about at the beginning of the segment, could them not going to this retreat be seen as a sign of Speaker Johnson's weakness? I mean, really, it's hard to imagine that this would ever happen under Kevin McCarthy's tenure.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia is a nice hotel. I've been there. It's hard to imagine that they're not going because they don't want to go and spend time at the Greenbrier. They're not going, as that anonymous member of Congress, Republican, said, because they don't want to spend time with each other, because there is so much. We talk about the dysfunction between and the polarization between the Democratic and the Republican parties, but you look within the Republican Party, there is so much polarization within that group that these members really don't have very much in common with each other. I mean, it might not have helped that the star speaker, Larry Kudlow, dropped out at the last minute. I don't know if that was partly what it was. But when you have members of Congress saying, listen, my big fear is being primaried from the right, not by somebody who I disagree with on policy, but because they want somebody who they say we have to shout and scream more. Well, shouting and screaming doesn't suit many members of these Congress. They don't come to Washington to shout and scream. They try to come to Washington to get things done. And if you look at any bar chart of the amount of bills that have been passed last year in Congress, it falls off a cliff. I mean, it's the lowest number in decades. And that is intensely frustrating, as clearly Ken Buck thinks.
You know, Jonathan, to Katty's point, they may not like each other, and yet for some reason, when there's a common denominator behind which they can unite, they seem to get their, you know what, together to be able to do that. You had an exclusive interview, sit down with President Joe Biden immediately after he had delivered that really fiery State of the Union speech. And you asked him about the GOP and its response to the threat that Putin is posing not only to Ukraine, but to democracy at large. And we wanted to take a quick listen to what President Biden had to say in response.
Well, I think some of them still do stand for it, but they're pretty much intimidated by Trump right now. Yesterday, he spends the time at his mansion with at his resort with Orban. He talks about his great respect for, the president of North Korea. I mean, he praises Putin. I mean, it's a different world.
Jonathan, I know you yourself have had the privilege of having conversations with Ruth Ben-Ghiat and others and to talk about how Trump sees himself in such an authoritarian light. But like I just said, the GOP figures it out, though, when they can get together and not pass aid packages to help Ukraine, right? Holding that hostage because of border deals. How much should Americans be concerned that the GOP actually views Putin as an ideological ally at this point?
Well, I mean, I think the evidence of that is very clear. Part of the question that I asked the president was, how did it feel for him to, talk about protecting democracy, talk about the threat that Russia poses, talk about the threat to our own democracy? How did it feel to say all these things in front of a party where they used to believe in those things? And, for him, that's what's so galling. We used to know what the Republican Party stood for. And the Republican Party that we grew up around, meaning 2 terms of Reagan, a term of H.W. Bush, two terms of W, Russia was not a friend. Putin was not someone we learn over and over and over again, couldn't do business with. And so I think with the president's fiery State of the Union address, his multiple speeches about the threats to American democracy at home, but also abroad, yes, the American people should be very worried about a second Trump White House, because he's making it very clear that if he gets another term, there will be lots of meetings and lots of phone calls and lots of backslapping with leaders of North Korea, of Russia taking over Ukraine, Orban being even more ascendant. It'll be a rogues gallery of I can't even get the words out of my mouth. It is a rogues gallery of American allies, but they would be American allies who are anti-democratic.
He's a very formidable opponent for Trump's lawyers.
In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens.
In the middle of a presidential election, a critical moment for American democracy.
It lands us right in the middle of a presidential campaign. It is unavoidably going to be tainted with the appearance of politics at play. Obviously, that's the card that Donald Trump will play.
They waited right to the middle of an election until I became the dominant force in the polls. I got indicted over bull. I got indicted. I get indicted for saying the election was rigged.
If he's convicted, then he's, running for president as someone who has been found guilty of federal crimes.
I love that mugshot. I love that beautiful woman right there with the mugshot.
To say the stakes for that trial are high doesn't even begin to cover it, really. We often, in the media, use the phrase trial of the century for this sensational trial or that one, but really, this would be, I think, the trial of the century. Because I cannot imagine anything more important than a former president on trial, charged with trying to subvert American democracy.
Tensions are still high following the chaos at the Capitol.
The federal indictment has its roots in the aftermath of the January 6th attack.
The chaos here has shaken the U.S. Capitol and the country.
Our nation's capital under a state of emergency, under a citywide lockdown.
In Congress, there were calls to create a blue-ribbon bipartisan commission.
A 9/11-style commission to look into the causes of the attack.
A bill to create a bipartisan commission faces an uphill battle in the Senate.
What was amazing was that the Senate Republicans refused to do that. To do what Congress has done in many previous incidents of great national catastrophe or crisis or controversy, which is to create a bipartisan special committee across both chambers.
Republicans in Congress, led by Senator Mitch McConnell, wouldn't support forming a commission that might go after Trump.
Leader McConnell almost instinctively goes into damage control mode. He's not necessarily going to go out on a limb when the rest of his caucus isn't going to go with him.
In the face of Republican opposition, the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, created a committee of her own.
Morning. With great solemnity and sadness, I'm announcing that the House will be establishing a select committee on the January 6th insurrection.
The House of Representatives today did what the Senate would not, voted to create a select committee.
It was the hope of Pelosi and the Democratic majority that they'd be able to pick off at least some Republican support, that there wouldn't be that great a pushback. But in fact, there was, and in the end, only 2 Republicans voted for the formation of that committee. And in fact, those 2 Republicans, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, were the 2 Republicans who ended up serving on the committee.
The fact that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are the only 2 House Republicans who believe that we should know what happened on January 6th, that people should obey subpoenas from Congress, that people should provide documents when requested, and that's itself incredibly astonishing.
They would spend a year and a half examining the evidence. Tim Heaphy was the chief investigator. A former U.S. attorney, Heaphy led the independent review of the violence in Charlottesville in 2017 and was now taking on January 6th.
We ended up hiring, I think it was 14 or 15 former prosecutors, lawyers that have the skill set to interview witnesses, to digest a large amount of documents, and to sort of discern what's relevant and separate that from what's not. That skill set is developed largely by trying cases, by investigating cases in federal and local prosecutors' offices.
They conducted more than 1,000 interviews.
The House Select Committee is shifting into high gear, preparing to do battle with some pretty big names in the Trump world.
Reviewed millions of documents.
The House committee probing the January 6th Capitol riot has issued 10 new subpoenas.
Thousands of hours of video evidence.
These subpoenas brings the focus to the actions of former President Donald Trump in the days and weeks leading up to the insurrection.
They're con people, they're con artists.
From the beginning, Trump denounced the committee.
The select committee on January, like these people are legitimate. Every one of them is a radical left hater.
The committee issued a subpoena to none other than former President Trump himself.
He refused to cooperate.
Trump suing the January 6th committee to block a subpoena for his testimony.
And while many of his aides did testify, others followed his lead.
Criminal contempt charges against former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows.
Peter Navarro refusing to cooperate with the January 6th committee.
The committee's final report spans 692 pages. A case against Donald Trump. A blueprint for Special Counsel Jack Smith.
We saw our work as the first step in a process and not the end of the process. It's very clear that the Select Committee laid the path down for the Department of Justice.
The January 6th case that will be heard in Judge Chutkan's courtroom in Washington, D.C. has the most striking resemblance to what unspooled itself from the January 6th committee. The basis of the indictment looks like a carbon copy of what the January 6th committee uncovered.
A lot of the evidence that we uncovered is now in the hands of the Department of Justice. I just think all what we see now is a byproduct of the work of the January Select Committee.
Benny Thompson, a longtime Democratic congressman, chaired the committee.
Benny Thompson is a Mississippi congressman, a black man who grew up during the civil rights era in Mississippi, during the last vestiges of Jim Crow. And saw how hard fought the franchise to vote was for so many black Americans.
In January 6th, Thompson saw parallels.
Well, one of the symbols of Southern resistance to voting rights and equal opportunity was the Confederate battle flag. And to see that flag being waved by many of the protesters brought back those memories.
When he saw rioters storm the Capitol carrying the Confederate battle flag, essentially trying to take away the votes of the American people. That, I know, affected him profoundly, and certainly was a driving factor in the way that he led the Select Committee.
Thompson's committee had gathered a trove of information. The challenge, what to do with it.
The one thing that we knew was the information that we have is compelling. The thing we needed to do was tell that to the American people in a compelling way. So that's why we brought in a former president of ABC News.
Yeah, I got a call pretty much out of the blue from the January 6th committee. They wanted a storyteller. And while they were brilliant lawyers, storytelling for a mass audience is not what they do.
To bring in a guy like this who would think outside the box really did prove to be fruitful. And it was Goldston who really began to envision this as, in a way, a kind of mini-series, that there would be, sort of 9 episodes, and that these episodes would tackle particular themes.
Attack on the Capitol, the investigation.
The first hearing was primetime television.
As the nation is about to witness a defining moment, the first hearing before the country, the results of the January 6th investigation.
This is an extraordinary moment in American history.
When it came to that first hearing, we knew how high the stakes were.
Is about to hold its first primetime hearing.
We were either gonna, make people realize that this was important, or once you've lost them, you've lost them for good.
On the evening of June 9th, 8:01 p.m., the doors opened. My heart was beating pretty fast on June 9th. And it was a real question of, is this going to work or not?
All right, everybody, here we go. 5 on the line, please.
I'm in this tiny control room right up the stairs from Cannon Caucus. And we count down to the start of the hearing. And at that point, what can you do?
Here we go. In 3, 2, 1.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection.
We wanted to make sure that